On a December night in 1989, KGB officer Vladimir Putin was burning secret documents in his Dresden office. The chimney worked non-stop for 3 days straight. Neighbors complained about the thick smoke that covered the streets of the East German city. But what exactly was he destroying with such thoroughness? What secrets could have changed our understanding of the entire Cold War history? Were these lists of agents buried deep in Western governments? Documents about secret operations that could discredit entire political systems? Or maybe evidence of events that officially never happened? The answer to this question lies not only in the documents themselves, but in the nature of the organization that for nearly 40 years kept in fear not only its own citizens, but half the planet. The KGB wasn't just a secret service. It became a system of thinking, a way of existing for an entire civilization. And when this system began to crumble, its carriers understood. They needed to destroy not only the papers, but the very memory of how the Soviet world actually functioned. To understand the KGB phenomenon, we need to look at its origins. When Joseph Stalin died in March 1953, his successors faced a complex question: what to do with the huge repression machine created over the previous decades? Lavrenti Beria, who headed the combined Ministry of Internal Affairs and State Security, wielded such power that he could challenge anyone in the party leadership. Beria's arrest in June 1953 became a turning point. The new leadership headed by Nikita Khrushchev understood. They needed a fundamentally new model of secret services. They had to be powerful enough to protect the state, but not so independent as to pose a threat to the party itself. This is how the idea of creating the Committee for State Security was born, an organization that formally reported to the government but actually became an instrument of the Politburo. On March 13, 1954, a decree was signed creating the KGB under the Council of Ministers of the USSR. At first glance, this was just a reorganization of existing structures. But in reality, a new type of secret service was born, more sophisticated, technologically equipped, and ideologically motivated than its predecessors. The first head of the KGB became Ivan Serov, a man with extensive experience in punitive work. It was under his leadership that the face of the new organization began to form. If the NKVD was an instrument of mass terror, the KGB transformed into a scalpel, capable of precise but no less effective operations. The creation of the KGB coincided with the beginning of a new era in international relations. The Cold War was gaining momentum, and the USSR needed instruments for global confrontation with the West. The KGB became this instrument. If in Stalin's era, Soviet secret services focused mainly on internal enemies, the KGB from the very beginning thought in terms of global struggle. The new organization inherited from its predecessors vast experience, personnel, and technical capabilities. But most importantly, it received a new mission. The KGB had to not just protect the Soviet system, it had to spread it throughout the world. This was an organization with global ambitions that viewed the entire planet as its field of activity. From the very beginning, the KGB was formed as an elite organization. The best university graduates, people with impeccable biographies and high motivation came there. They received the best training, the most modern equipment, the broadest opportunities for career growth. In exchange, absolute devotion to the system and readiness to perform any tasks were demanded of them. The first main directorate, the brain center of foreign intelligence, was the most prestigious unit of the KGB. Its employees worked in all the world's capitals, penetrated the highest echelons of Western countries' power, obtained the most valuable secrets. This was the elite of the elite, people with excellent education, language skills, able to work in the most difficult conditions. The structure of the first main directorate reflected the geography of world politics. Departments were created on a regional principle. The American direction was headed by the most talented operatives. The European dealt with traditional USSR opponents. The Chinese, after the split in the socialist camp, became no less important than the American. Every legal KGB residency, and they existed in practically all countries of the world, was a real center for information gathering and influence. Residents worked under diplomatic cover, using embassies and trade representations as bases for their activities. They created agent networks, financed friendly organizations, conducted influence operations. But the most secret was the activity of illegal residencies. These agents lived under false names, often for decades, creating biographies and reputations in their host countries. They were real sleeper agents, ready to activate at a critical moment. Their training lasted years and included not only professional skills, but deep study of the culture, mentality, and daily life of their assigned countries. The second main directorate protected the Soviet rear from Western intelligence penetration. Its employees met every foreigner entering the USSR, accompanied tourist groups, controlled all international contacts of Soviet citizens. They understood the USSR was a fortress, and every hole in its walls could become gates for the enemy. Special attention was paid to controlling foreign diplomats, journalists, businessmen. Each of them was under constant surveillance. Their contacts were carefully recorded. All attempts to obtain information were blocked. The second directorate created a system that made it practically impossible for foreigners to collect intelligence on Soviet territory. But no less important was working with Soviet citizens who had contacts with foreigners. Every scientist who collaborated with foreign colleagues, every translator, every guide, all of them automatically came under KGB attention. They were carefully checked, prophylactic talks were conducted with them, some were recruited as agents. The third main directorate watched over the army, understanding that the military was the only force in the USSR capable of challenging the party. After revolutions and coups in various countries around the world, the Soviet leadership well understood the danger that dissatisfied generals could pose. In every military unit, on every ship, in every garrison, there were employees or agents of the Third Directorate. They wore military uniforms, held military ranks, but their real mission was completely different. They monitored officers' moods, controlled their political views, reported any signs of dissatisfaction. The strategic missile forces and Navy were under special care of the Third Directorate. People who had access to nuclear weapons were under constant surveillance. Their families, friends, even children's teachers. All this was the subject of Chekists' attention. The Fifth Directorate, Ideological Security, dealt with fighting dissent, controlled writers, artists, scientists, and students, and also persecuted samizdat and religious communities, especially the Ukrainian Greek Catholic Church. The Seventh Directorate, External Surveillance, specialized in invisible surveillance using disguised agents, technology, and complex surveillance schemes for dissidents. The Eighth Main Directorate, Cryptography, created Soviet ciphers and broke foreign ones using advanced computers and radio interception, could read Western government communications in real time. The Ninth Directorate, Leadership Protection, was responsible for Soviet leaders' security, organized protection during trips, checked personnel, and used disinformation methods en routes. The 15th Directorate, Strategic Facilities, protected nuclear plants, missile bases, and defense enterprises, combining physical security with counterintelligence and ensuring maximum secrecy. The agent network was the foundation of the entire KGB system. But this wasn't a chaotic mass of informants. It was a clearly organized system built on the pyramid principle. At the top were qualified professional agents capable of performing the most complex tasks. Below were various categories of employees and informants. Residents were career KGB employees who worked under legal or illegal cover. They managed agent networks, organized operations, maintained communication with the center. Their training lasted years and included studying foreign languages, psychology, communication techniques, conspiracy methods. Agents were recruited foreigners or Soviet citizens who consciously cooperated with the KGB. The motives for their cooperation could be different: ideological convictions, material interest, blackmail, revenge. The most valuable agents had access to state secrets, worked in governments, parliaments, foreign intelligence services. Trusted persons were the most numerous category of KGB employees. They weren't professional spies, but performed individual assignments, transmitted messages, observed certain people, collected information within their capabilities. Informants were people who episodically provided information to the KGB. Often, they didn't even realize they were working for the secret services. These could be hotel employees who reported on foreign guests, taxi drivers who told about suspicious passengers, hairdressers who passed on rumors and gossip. Agent recruitment methods in the KGB reached the level of true art. The most diverse approaches were used depending on a person's psychological type and life situation. Idealists were convinced of the justice of communist ideas. Careerists were lured with prospects of career advancement. Weak people were blackmailed. Poor ones were bribed. Particularly cynical were the methods of compromising. The KGB created situations where people committed compromising acts, then used this as a means of pressure. Provocative meetings were organized. Intimate relationships were recorded. Moments of potential agents' weakness were awaited. The KGB wasn't just a repressive organization. It became a real scientific technical center that developed and implemented the most advanced methods of controlling people. Soviet secret services often were ahead of their time, creating technologies that appeared in the West only years or decades later. KGB operational technology was among the most advanced in the world. Soviet secret services invested enormous resources in developing technical means of intelligence and surveillance, often outpacing Western competitors by years. In foreign embassy offices in Moscow, dissidents' apartments, hotel rooms for foreign guests, microphones were installed that could transmit sound over significant distances. Both wired systems and radio transmitters the size of a coin were used. Telephone wiretapping covered practically the entire long-distance and international communication network of the USSR. Special services could wiretap any call, record conversations, analyze their content. Voice databases of suspicious persons were created, allowing automatic identification in telephone conversations. Mail interception was conducted with German punctuality. Every letter arriving from abroad or sent beyond the USSR borders passed through KGB employees' hands. Special methods were developed for opening envelopes without damaging seals, photographing letters, chemically analyzing them for invisible inks. Photography and video recording were also widely used for surveillance and compromising. Special photo laboratories were created where fake documents were made. Compromising photos were retouched. Provocative materials were assembled. Soviet secret services thoroughly studied methods of influencing human psychology, ways of breaking will, brainwashing techniques. KGB investigators underwent special training in interrogation psychology. They knew how to find weak spots in a person's character, how to use their fears and complexes, how to force them to tell the truth. Various techniques were used, from psychological pressure to physical exhaustion. Particularly developed were disorientation methods. A person could be arrested at night, driven around the city for hours in a car with closed windows, kept in a cell without a clock and windows to deprive them of time sense. Sensory deprivation methods were used, complete silence, darkness, or, conversely, constant lighting and noise. The use of psychotropic drugs also took place, although this was officially denied. There were special laboratories where various chemical substances capable of affecting human consciousness, suppressing will, causing hallucinations were tested. The confrontation between Soviet and Western intelligence services became one of the most dramatic pages of the Cold War. This was a real-world war fought by methods of intelligence, counterintelligence, and psychological influence. The KGB and its Western opponents turned the entire planet into a chessboard where every square could become the site of a new operation. The Cambridge 5 case became one of the greatest successes of Soviet intelligence. Kim Philby, Donald Maclean, Guy Burgess, Anthony Blunt, and John Cairncross, British students recruited by the NKVD back in the 1930s, transmitted the most valuable secrets for decades. Kim Philby reached the highest positions in British intelligence MI6 and even aspired to the post of its head. He had access to the most secret operations, knew the names of British agents worldwide, was aware of Western plans regarding the USSR. His exposure in 1963 and escape to Moscow became a real blow to British intelligence services. Donald Maclean worked in Britain's Foreign Office and had access to diplomatic secrets. He transmitted information about negotiations between Western allies, NATO plans, economic agreements to the Soviet side. Anthony Blunt, who formerly worked as an art historian and was even curator of the Royal Art Collection, actually coordinated Soviet agent activities in British elite circles. His exposure in 1979 caused a scandal in the British establishment. No less impressive were KGB's successes in penetrating American intelligence services. Aldrich Ames, a high-ranking CIA officer who worked for the KGB from 1985, caused irreparable damage to American intelligence. He betrayed dozens of American agents in the USSR, many of whom paid with their lives. But the most telling story was at the end of World War II, when Soviet pioneers ceremoniously presented the U.S. ambassador in Moscow with a large wooden coat of arms of the United States. It was made beautifully and masterfully, decorated with the Great Seal of the USA, and the ambassador proudly hung it in his office. The Americans didn't suspect that inside the coat of arms, Soviet engineers from the NKVD, future KGB, had hidden a unique listening device that received the name The Thing. The device was created by Lev Terman. This bug had neither batteries nor wires. Inside was a thin membrane and resonator that emitted nothing independently. It was activated only when a radio wave of a certain frequency was directed at it from outside. In response, the device began to resonate and reflect the signal modulated by membrane oscillations. Essentially, it transmitted sound from the room, reflecting only those waves that coincided with voice vibrations. It was almost impossible to find the bug with ordinary devices because it was absolutely passive and remained silent until illuminated with a special radio signal. Only in 1952 did British and American specialists accidentally discover this wiretap during embassy inspection. The discovered device made an enormous impression on Western intelligence services. So ingenious was its construction. This incident became a classic of espionage history and a symbol of Soviet engineering ingenuity in intelligence. Robert Hansen, an FBI agent who for 22 years transmitted secrets to the KGB and its successors, revealed practically all American operations on Soviet territory. His case became one of the most sensational spy scandals in U.S. history. But Western intelligence services also had their successes. Oleg Penkovsky, a GRU colonel who worked for British and American intelligence, transmitted extremely valuable information about Soviet missile programs. His materials helped the West correctly assess Soviet capabilities during the Cuban Missile Crisis. We already have a video about this story on our channel. Alexander Ogorodnik, a Soviet Foreign Ministry employee, transmitted secret diplomatic documents to the CIA. Georgy Toshchin, a KGB officer in France, revealed to the Americans the structure and working methods of Soviet intelligence in Europe. Technical intelligence became a separate front in the spy war. The KGB created a special Line X program aimed at stealing Western technologies. Soviet agents obtained blueprints of the newest aircraft, computer programs, industrial equipment. Vetrov was a KGB officer in Moscow, Directorate T, Line X, who transmitted materials to French DST in 1981–82. Precisely this data allowed the West to mow down the techno-sabotage network and then conduct operations deliberately supplying defective technologies. Thanks to these materials, the CIA was able to identify most Soviet agents in Western technology companies. Moreover, Americans began supplying the Soviet side with defective equipment and incorrect blueprints, leading to a series of accidents and failures in the USSR. Berlin became the capital of the espionage world. The divided city, where different sectors were controlled by different states, created ideal conditions for intelligence activities. The KGB and Western intelligence services waged a real underground war there. The tunnel under Berlin, dug by Americans and British to wiretap Soviet telephone lines, became one of the most large-scale technical projects of the Cold War. For almost a year, Western intelligence services intercepted thousands of Soviet officers' conversations. But the KGB knew about the tunnel's existence from the very beginning thanks to their agent George Blake, who worked in British intelligence. The Soviet side deliberately allowed the operation to continue, transmitting disinformation through the wiretapped lines and controlling what information the opponent received. Spy exchanges on the Glienicke Bridge in Berlin became a symbol of the Cold War. The most famous of such exchanges occurred in 1962 when Soviet intelligence officer Rudolf Abel was exchanged for American pilot Francis Powers, shot down over the USSR. Rudolf Abel, real name William Fisher, was one of the most qualified Soviet intelligence officers. He worked in the USA disguised as a photographer, creating an extensive agent network. His mastery of conspiracy was so high that American counterintelligence spent years uncovering him. The all-seeing eye, life under surveillance. For ordinary USSR citizens, the KGB was an omnipresent symbol of power that determined all aspects of their lives. Soviet people understood from childhood. They lived in a society of total control, where every word, every action could become the subject of competent organs, attention. The education system in Soviet schools was built to form people inclined to informing and mutual control. Children were taught to be vigilant against enemies of the people, to report to teachers about suspicious parental conversations, about foreign radio broadcasts listened to at home. Pioneer organizations became schools for future informants. Pioneers had to watch each other, report discipline violations, incorrect statements, deviations from the official party line. Those who didn't show sufficient political vigilance were criticized at meetings, expelled from pioneers, surrounded by an atmosphere of condemnation. In universities and institutes, the atmosphere of control was even more intense. Every student knew, among their classmates were KGB informants who reported on collective moods, political conversations, contacts with foreigners. Even the most innocent political jokes could become grounds for expulsion from university. Teachers were also under constant surveillance. Their lectures were periodically attended by representatives of party organs and the KGB, who checked correspondence of taught material with official ideology. Any deviations from the approved program, critical remarks about Soviet reality were immediately recorded and became subjects of investigation. Special control was established over people who had access to secret information. Defense enterprise workers, scientists engaged in secret developments, diplomats, all automatically became objects of KGB attention. Their personal files were kept in special departments. Surveillance was established over them. Their contacts were carefully studied. Even everyday conversations could become dangerous. Soviet citizens learned to distinguish where they could speak openly and where they needed to be careful. At home, among closest friends, in the bathhouse, there one could allow critical remarks. But at work, in public places, in the presence of strangers, the rule prevailed. The tongue is your enemy. Particularly cynical was the practice of involving family members in cooperation with the KGB. Wives were encouraged to spy on husbands, children to inform on parents, parents to control children. Family ties, which should have been the strongest, were destroyed under pressure from the system of mutual espionage. Control extended even to citizens' private lives. The KGB was interested in whom they met, what books they read, what music they listened to, how they spent their free time. Cultural tastes were viewed as indicators of political loyalty. Interest in Western music, literature, fashion automatically made a person suspicious. Foreign tourists in the USSR were under particularly close surveillance. Their routes were planned in advance. The hotels where they stayed were equipped with listening devices. The guides who accompanied them were KGB employees or agents. Soviet citizens who had contacts with foreigners automatically fell under suspicion. Even a chance conversation with a tourist on the street could become a reason for being called to the KGB for a prophylactic talk. People were warned about possible recruitment attempts, forced to promise to report all contacts with foreigners. The empire's collapse and KGB dissolution. Perestroika, begun by Mikhail Gorbachev in 1985, marked the beginning of the end not only for the USSR but also for the KGB. The policy of glasnost undermined one of the main foundations of Secret Service's existence, the monopoly on information. When people gained the opportunity to openly discuss what had been discussed only in whispers for years, the system of total control began to crack. KGB chairman Vladimir Khrushchev initially tried to adapt to new conditions. He publicly supported perestroika, spoke about the need to democratize Secret Service's work, even allowed individual journalists to visit KGB headquarters on Lubyanka. But this was only tactics aimed at preserving the organization's influence. Actually, KGB leadership from the very beginning was negative toward Gorbachev's reforms. They understood democratization and glasnost would inevitably lead to loss of their power and possible exposure of past crimes. Therefore, opposition to the perestroika course began to mature within the KGB. The first alarming signals appeared already in 1986 after the Chernobyl catastrophe. The KGB traditionally dealt with concealing information about industrial accidents, but the scale of the Chernobyl tragedy made complete silence impossible. The world community learned about the accident, and this became a blow to the prestige of both the Soviet system as a whole and the KGB in particular. National movements in Union republics became another challenge for the KGB. In the Baltics, Ukraine, Transcaucasus, organizations began to emerge that openly advocated independence from Moscow. Traditional methods of suppressing such movements, arrests of leaders, dispersal of rallies, intimidation of activists, no longer worked under glasnost conditions. The situation in Ukraine was particularly painful for the KGB. The Ukrainian Helsinki Union, RUK, other national democratic organizations operated increasingly openly. Former political prisoners who previously were forced to remain silent began publicly telling about KGB working methods, about torture in prisons and camps. The Chernobyl case became symbolic for the KGB crisis. Vyacheslav Chornovil, who was already a well-known dissident at that time, was one of the first to begin publishing truthful information about the disaster's scale. The KGB tried to stop him, but under glasnost conditions, this was already impossible. The international situation also wasn't favorable for the KGB. Détente in relations with the West, signing of disarmament treaties led to cuts in intelligence operation funding. Many experienced agents were left without work, foreign residencies were closed. But the biggest blow was the exposure of a number of Soviet spies in the West. The cases of Aldrich Ames, Robert Hansen, and other KGB agents showed that Soviet intelligence wasn't omnipotent as presented in propaganda. KGB prestige both internally and abroad began to fall rapidly. Internal conflicts began within the KGB itself. The younger generation of officers who came to service during perestroika years had different views on Secret Service's role in democratic society. Old cadres, conversely, believed that reforms were leading the country to destruction. The split in the KGB deepened after the 1989 elections of USSR People's Deputies. Several Secret Service employees were elected deputies and began criticizing their organization's working methods. This was an unprecedented case in Soviet history. Particularly painful for the KGB were investigations of Stalin-era crimes. Commissions for rehabilitating repression victims began declassifying archives, revealing executioners' names, publishing documents about mass shootings and deportations. The KGB, as NKVD's successor, found itself under threat of moral condemnation. The August 1991 Putsch, the final act. The attempted coup on August 19 to 21, 1991, became the final act in the KGB drama. KGB chairman Vladimir Khrushchev became one of its main organizers and ideologists. Khrushchev and his associates understood. If democratization processes continued, the KGB as an organization was doomed to liquidation or radical reform. The new Union Treaty, planned to be signed on August 20th, envisioned significant expansion of republics' rights, which automatically meant weakening of central organs, including the KGB. Preparation for the putsch was conducted in deep secrecy. All KGB capabilities were used: agent networks, technical means, experience in conducting special operations. The plan was to arrest all potential oppositionists overnight, establish strict control over mass media, introduce martial law. But the putschists underestimated the degree of changes that had occurred in Soviet society during perestroika years. People were no longer afraid to take to the streets to protest against illegal power. Journalists continued working despite prohibitions. Even part of the security forces refused to carry out putschists' orders. Particularly symbolic was the resistance in Moscow near the Russian Council of Ministers building, where President Boris Yeltsin was in session. Thousands of Muscovites surrounded the building with a living ring, ready to defend democratically elected power from usurpers. The KGB proved unprepared for such developments. The organization that had suppressed any resistance for decades suddenly faced mass civil disobedience. Traditional methods, arrests, intimidation, violence, didn't work against thousands of people who took to the streets. After the putsch's failure, the KGB's fate was decided. On August 24th, Russian President Boris Yeltsin signed a decree terminating KGB activities on Russian territory. Secret Service employees were forbidden to enter KGB buildings. Archives were sealed. Leadership was arrested. Symbolic was the moment when a crowd of demonstrators toppled the monument to Felix Dzerzhinsky near the KGB building on Lubyanka. Iron Felix, as the founder of Soviet security organs was called, had been considered an untouchable symbol for decades. His fall meant the end of an entire era. In September-October 1991, the USSR KGB was finally disbanded. Its functions were distributed among several new organizations, each receiving only part of the former all-powerful structure's powers. Although the KGB ceased to exist, its successor FSB was able to preserve its legacy, reform itself, and continue its work. Don't forget to subscribe and hit the like button.